Are visiting with us, may have been here for the first time. We'd like to invite you to join our society. There are copies of the Treasurer's Report in both the Executive Board and the regular monthly meeting minutes from May on the table out there. If you didn't sign in, please do so before you leave. I've encouraged everybody who really wanted to look around to do it before it gets very late, because we improvised some lighting, but generally speaking, we don't have any. So, but this is Gaines Tavern, going to be the Walton Gaines Tavern History Center. We did, and for those of you who don't know, I'm also a member of City Council, and Lee Frakes back there is as well. We have received our first grant money. That's why we wanted people to be able to see the building as it is now. There's a tremendous amount to be done, but the next time you see it, there'll be work done on the outside. We have to start with the outside to just keep it from falling down over a period of time, I guess. Well, I think I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Elizabeth. This is Elizabeth Comer. When she was an intern at Northern, she did extensive research, not just on the property, but also on the family, on the generation of Gaineses. So, and she went on to North Carolina University?
North Carolina State.
North Carolina State. And you have a master's in?
A Master's of Arts in Public History.
In Public History. And she has said that she would like to, at some point in her life, continue her research from where she left off with this property. But I'm just going to turn it over to her, and she'll tell you a lot about it.
As she said.
I'm sorry, first before we start, do these people that are out in the hall need a chair? There's 2 chairs back here.
Yeah, that'd be fine. 2? Just one?
There are 2. Thank you, Elizabeth.
No problem. As she said, my name is Elizabeth Comer, and I've just recently graduated from NC State University. I would first like to thank Ann Leek, the Boone County Historical Society, for asking me to be here, and as well as Dr. Deborah Myers of Northern Kentucky University, Carl Litzenmeyer of the Northern Kentucky Heritage Magazine, and Dr. Paul Tincati of Thomas More College, who have helped me in a lot of the research projects, especially with this project that I worked on. They were there for me a lot. They were very good resources. I became involved with the history of the Gaines Tavern in 2003 when I was working as a student intern with the Northern Kentucky Heritage Magazine. Carl Litzenmeyer was my editor, and he asked me to write an article about the history of this house as one of my assignments. I met with Mrs. Jurdy, who was the owner at the time, and she had a binder full of newspaper clippings and other information that she had gathered. So what I did is I borrowed that binder from her, took notes on all of that information, and began to go through and try and verify that information to find out what was right and what was not. I focused a lot on the line of ownership for the house, because we know that the house was built by the Gaines, but from there it kind of gets a little confused. And the timeline of when the Gaines bought the property is also slightly confusing, which I'll get into in a minute. The information that I'm presenting to you today is based on on documents that I found at the Boone County Courthouse, various newspapers from Northern Kentucky from the 1800s, as well as the various libraries in Boone County. The information that I have not found as of yet includes many of the family's personal documents, as well as any of the business documents from the tavern. At some point, I spent a year doing the research, so at some point you just have to stop researching and publish the article. So Carl was very lenient on what my deadline was. I just kept going, and he finally said I had to stop. However, as she said, I do plan on continuing some research. I haven't been able to in the last 2 years because I live in North Carolina, but at some point I want to come back to Kentucky and keep going with this. Can't do that just yet. The research that I'm presenting today is based on factual documents that I actually found or received copies of. There's always room for the expansion on the knowledge of a historical topic, So if you have any information that I perhaps do not know about or haven't seen, trust me, there is plenty of that out there. Or if you have any questions, I would be happy to listen after the presentation. The Gaines Tavern is named for Abner Gaines, who was born in Orange County, Virginia on October 8, 1766. He married Elizabeth Matthews on December 8, 1792, and the couple first appeared in Kentucky in Woodford County, according to the 1800 census. They moved to Boone County, Kentucky in 1804, as shown in both the tax and court records. The tax records from 1804 state that the Gaines family owned 3 slaves and 5 horses in 1804, but they did not pay taxes as landowners until 1808. This is significant because Abner took out his first tavern bond on October 24, 1808, so chances are he owned the land that he was building the tavern on. That license allowed him, quote, to keep a tavern at his dwelling house in the county of Boone, and provide in his said tavern good, wholesome, cleanly lodging, and diet for travelers, and stablage provender, or pasturage for horses. The license also stated that Abner, quote, shall not suffer or permit any unlawful gaming in his house, nor suffer any person to tipple or drink more than is necessary at any time, or suffer any disorderly or scandalous behavior to be practiced in his house. Abner renewed these licenses each year through December 1818. The tavern bonds show that a structure existed on a property within Boone County as early as 1808, but they do not say who built that structure or exactly where the property was. Although the taverns show that he ran a tavern as of 1808, the court records of the land ownership are a little more difficult to follow. And I have a timeline over here that you might want to try and look at afterwards if that helps clarify things. A deed search revealed that Levi and Jane Todd of Fayette County were the earliest landowners. And just very briefly, it occurred to me that they are also from Lexington, where Mary Todd Lincoln was born. We are considering the possibility that they are related, although we have not had a chance to do the research yet to find out exactly how that connection exists. But one of those other things that I would love to be able to finish researching and have not had a chance to do yet. The Deed Book C in the Boone County Courthouse states that the Todds sold 300 acres on the main road from Georgetown to Cincinnati to Archibald and Lucy Reed of Boone County on December 1st, 1801. Just 5 years later, on February 22nd, 1806, the Reeds sold 200 acres of the land for $1,500 to Caleb Summers. And this is where things get a little bit confusing. On that same day, February 22nd, 1806, Summers mortgaged the land to Thomas Kennedy for 100 pounds, the British currency as opposed to $1, with an interest of 6% to be paid exactly a year later. However, the next day, Summers took out a second mortgage on the land with the man that he had bought the property from, Archibald Reed, for $265. A stipulation of that mortgage was that Summers had to deliver 200 gallons of merchantable whiskey to Reed in Georgetown and Scott County by April 23, 1806, only 2 months later. The mortgage also required Summers to deliver 330 gallons of whiskey by January 23, 1807. However, Summers defaulted on his mortgage with Reed, who took the issue to court and forced him to sell the property at auction. On June 27, 1808, Thomas Kennedy bid the highest amount and paid $414.12 for the entire 200 acres. It comes out to about $2.08 per acre, which even then was a steal. Abner Gaines bought the same 200 acres 5 years later on November 24, 1813, from Thomas Kennedy and his wife Dinah for $1,810. So far that's fairly clear. It was passed down, sold, and then it defaulted, and then it was sold at auction until Abner Gaines bought it. However, the deed immediately following the one where Abner Gaines bought the land from Thomas Kennedy states that Abner bought 192 acres of the same land from Caleb Summers on January 1st, 1809 for $1,666.66. This is 6 months after Kennedy bought the land at auction and approximately 4 years before Abner bought the land from Kennedy. From this evidence, my best guess is that Abner bought the land from Summers in 1809 and did not record the transaction until 4 years later. And this was just after Summers' mortgage situation had cleared up with the sale of the property at auction to Kennedy. And this is why I have my little chart so you can see how it goes down. However, this does not explain why Abner actually bought the same land twice from two different men. And that I have yet to figure out from another research. Summers then disappears from the court records, and this is the last mention I could find of him in Boone County. However, I have not had a chance to look in surrounding counties, so he may have married and moved somewhere else, or even moved just over to Kenton County. So despite the uncertainty of what the court records say, according to the land deeds and the tax records, Abner had control of the land between 1809 and 1813. Abner's first tavern bond is dated 1808, so one option is that he ran a tavern from the land, which was on a different location, or he was renting the land and running the tavern while he was here. The existence of the tavern bonds proved that the tavern existed, but not actually where it was, so that's what we're trying to figure out. Basically, I don't know who the original owner of the house was, although I'm sure that it was Abner Gaines because of the history and the information that I've been able to find. By all accounts, I've dated the construction of the house to between 1810 and 1815, since it's so unclear of when Abner actually moved in. The 1810 federal census shows Abner living in Boone County with his wife and 8 children plus 4 slaves. The court records show that Abner was very active in local politics. He served as sheriff of Boone County from 1815 to 1817, was the clerk of elections for several years, and was also a justice of the peace. Abner signed his name to many of the court proceedings, showing that he was present for those proceedings. Many of his sons were also active in both local and national politics. He and his wife Elizabeth had 13 children, 2 of whom died before the age of 5, and several of his remaining children led very notable lives. The oldest son, James Matthews Gaines, was a very wealthy and respected member of the Northern Kentucky community. He was born in Virginia in 1793 and married Elvira Towsey in August of 1827. James served as the first postmaster for the city of Walton, which was then known as Gaines Crossroads, and he was appointed by President James Madison on July 4th, 1815. James Matthews Gaines died on 1854 and is buried with his wife near Maplewood Farm at the Richwood Presbyterian Church. The next oldest son, John Pollard Gaines, was very involved in politics. Born in 1795 in Virginia, he served in the War of 1812 as well as the Mexican War from 1846 to 1848. At the beginning of the war, Kentucky Governor William Owsley commissioned John Pollard a major of the 1st Regiment of Kentucky Volunteer Cavalry of Mounted Men on May 28, 1846. While fighting in the Mexican War, he was arrested by the Mexican Army and was held in prison. However, he had been running for a congressional position, so while he was in a Mexican jail, he was popularly elected to Congress in 1847. The event appeared in an edition of Ripley's Believe It or Not, next to a picture of a chicken whose eggs had hatched before being laid. John Pollard rose through politics to be named the governor of the Oregon Territory in 1850. 2 of his 5 daughters, Harriet and Florella, died of yellow fever on the boat on the way to Oregon, and his wife Elizabeth died in August of 1851 after being thrown from her horse. John Pollard then married Margaret Burnside in 1852, and they lived together in Oregon until John's death in 1857. Another of Abner's sons, Archibald Kincaid Gaines, was also very well known in Boone County. His first wife, Margaret Dudley, died in 1849 after falling down a flight of stairs, so the next year he married Margaret's sister, Elizabeth. He lived with Elizabeth at Maplewood Farm, just a few miles from here, until when in 1856, one of his slaves, Margaret Garner, escaped to Cincinnati with her husband Robert and 4 of their children. They were staying at Margaret's cousin's home in Cincinnati when they were captured the next day by the slave catchers. Instead of sending her children back to slavery, she decided that it would be better for them to die, so she tried to kill all of them, and only succeeded in killing one, Mary, by slitting her throat. The other children survived, and Archibald became known because of the ensuing media coverage of the court cases that followed of whether she should be tried for murder. Although Abner and Elizabeth Gaines had many children who could have maintained the property, the house did not stay in the family for very long after Abner's death. Abner Gaines died on October 30th, 1839, and a death notice appeared in the papers just a month later. On November 29th, 1839, the Western Globe reported that Abner Gaines, an old and respectable citizen, had passed away. Abner's will stated that his youngest daughter, Mildred Pollard Gaines, should receive, quote, "the whole of my property in which I am in possession of, to wit, my plantation on which I live, containing about 236 acres, together with all of my negroes, stock of horses, cattle, sheep, hogs, farming utensils, with the express understanding that my wife, Elizabeth Gaines, enjoys the property donated to Mildred during her life." In his will, Abner claimed that the property was worth between $12,000 and $15,000, which was quite a bit of money back then. Elizabeth Gaines lived at the Gaines Tavern for a while, but eventually moved to Maplewood Farm to live with her oldest son, John Pollard. John sold that farm to his brother Archibald when he moved to Oregon to become governor there in 1850, and Elizabeth remained living at Maplewood Farm until her death on November 30th, 1861. The obituary in the Covington Journal announcing Elizabeth Gaines's death states, "The deceased was a woman of remarkable strength of character, which impressed itself upon all about her." Mildred Gaines held control of her father's property until her marriage to Anthony Davies. After the wedding, the couple sold the property to Mildred's brother, Archibald, in 1850. Archibald controlled the property until 1869, when he sold it out of the family to Harvey Hicks. If you're examining Abner's probate records, they reveal many interesting details about how the family used the property. Probate records are inventories of a person's property at the time of their death. They're usually used for tax purposes to find out what the person had and how much to tax them. But they also help if a person died without a will, and they help clear up who should get what to help divide the property. Abner's probate record lists everything that was in his house at the time he died in 1839 and the value of each item. For example, there were 2 side tables that were worth $15, a loom and wheel for $8, and kitchen utensils that were worth a total of $15. Some of the items demonstrate how the family used the home. There were 13 children, but by 1839 they were mostly grown and married and moved out of the house. However, there were 6 beds, steads, and clothing, which all had a value of $180. These most likely were used for the people who traveled and stayed here overnight as they were going south or north. Just the clothing for the beds was worth $30. Many of the other items show how the farm worked on the property. These farm animals that were listed include 25 sheep that were valued at $37.50, and 5 head of cattle that were worth $70. Other tools that the family used include a sledge and crowbar that were worth $6, a carriage and harness worth $100, and a gun that was worth $8. Abner also had 2 slaves that were listed in his probate records. Martha had a value of $350, and Ben had a value of $50. Many of these items seem very ordinary or cheap compared to today's standards, but you must remember that $100 in the 1800s, or even the 1900s, or to a college student today, had a much higher value than it does today. The fact that Abner owned an accordion, a piano, and a clock are all testaments to the wealth of the family, because it's not something that most people would have unless they're entertaining very important guests. There's a tree on the side of the house, which it could also be an example of how the property was used. If you look at it, you can see an iron chain hanging from the tree. Just a little lower are two pieces of iron that are sticking out. If you look around the tree, there's all kinds of iron sticking out, and a bar that looks like it's holding two of the branches together. The previous owner, Mrs. Jurdy, said that she thinks that these are pieces of the blacksmithing that was done on the property, and they possibly may have used that tree to hang some of the iron on it, and maybe it just got left there and the tree grew around it. Nothing that I've been able to verify, but it is interesting to see that it has been there for quite a while because it's a very large tree that's got iron sticking out of it. The overall value of Abner's possessions at the time of his death was approximately $1,700. On top of that, he had loaned money to other people, including some of his sons, for a value of $3,800. 4 of these loans were to his oldest son, James Gaines. Abner's total worth in 1839 was just over $5,500. This will shows how the wealth was distributed among Abner's family. As stated before, Mildred, the youngest daughter, received the property and most of the possessions that were within the house. Each of the other children received $1,000 several years before Abner wrote the will, but at the time of the writing of the will, Abner decided that that donation was now worth about $2,000. So even though he only gave them $1,000, he upped the amount arbitrarily. Several of the children also received horses, such as Arab and Robert P. Letcher. Other items given away include canes, clocks, and guns. When all this information is taken together, it shows that Abner was a fairly wealthy man, and the researchers can get a glimpse of how he used the land and the house through what was in it. This wealth probably came from the successful management of the Stagecoach Tavern. The success of Abner's Tavern is also shown in the amount of times that he renewed the licenses to keep the tavern open. Part of the popularity is that the tavern is just 20 miles south of Cincinnati, which made this the first stop on the stagecoach line that ran from Cincinnati to Lexington. Although the road between the two cities had existed for many years, Abner opened his stagecoach line as early as 1818. On May 16, 1818, an advertisement in the Western Monitor, a Lexington, Kentucky newspaper, stated the cost for passage on Abner's stagecoach line from Cincinnati to Lexington was approximately 10 cents a mile, which included 14 pounds of luggage. However, if you were wanting to bring more than 100 pounds of luggage, that was also charged the same as a person, 10 cents a mile. Although the advertisement could be seen as the opening of the stagecoach line, Dr. Paul Tincotti with Thomas More College has said that this could also just be the reopening of the line after the winter. Because this was published in May, during the winter the roads would get very bad, very muddy, and it made travel very difficult. So often stagecoach lines would just shut down, so this could be the reopening of the line. But that 1818 is the earliest date that we could find in connection to that. The conditions of the roads in the early 1800s were typically very bad because they consisted of dirt paths that quickly became deep ruts that filled with mud during rainstorms or snowstorms. The poor condition of the roads made for a very rough ride, and a trip to Lexington, which currently takes just over an hour depending on where you're going, could take up to 2 days. The Kentucky General Assembly realized how bad the roads had become, and in 1834 the Assembly established the Covington and Lexington Turnpike Company, which had the job of modernizing the roads. Macadamized roads had been appearing throughout the state, and the Covington and Lexington Turnpike Company decided to use this method. According to Webster's Dictionary, macadamizing means to cover as a road or street with small, broken stones so as to form a smooth, hard, convex surface. So they're getting closer to paved roads. On April 14, 1843, the Licking Valley Register announced that John Pollard Gaines had become the president of the company. With the new roads, travel became smoother and faster, though the changes did not occur quickly. Construction on the road progressed at a very slow pace and was very expensive. So in 1839, 5 years later, the Kentucky General Assembly adjusted the original company charter to create 2 companies. Williamstown was the halfway point between Cincinnati and Lexington, so residents south of Williamstown became stockholders in that company, and residents to the north became stockholders in that company. Each, depending on where you live, you were in charge of building that section of the road. and financing it. By the early 1850s, the repairs on the road were completed, and the two companies merged back to the original Covington and Lexington Turnpike Company. With the completion of the improvements, the 2-day trip from Cincinnati to Lexington was cut to only 12 hours, which even today you would think should not take 12 hours to get there, but that was a huge improvement for the 1850s. I do not know when the stagecoach line quit running, but I would hazard to guess that with Abner's death in 1839 and all the construction that started in the mid-1830s, the road conditions were made even worse, and that traffic slowed due to this construction. However, US 25 still runs from Cincinnati to Lexington, so even today we still use that road. The stagecoach line was not the only type of transportation that was associated with this house. Two railroads, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad and the Cincinnati Southern Railroad, currently pass on each side of the house, and both lines have had their own unique history. When construction began in 1867 and 1868, the workers had to move the Gaines family cemetery off of the property. The family is currently buried in Highland Cemetery in Kenton County. At the time, Archibald Gaines owned the land, although he sold it in 1869 to Harvey Hicks before the railroads can be completed. In 1869, the Louisville and Frankfort Railroad completed what is now known as the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which is at the front of the house. It's this one over here. The construction began on the line in 1867, going from Louisville to Covington, and the company consolidated in 1869 with the Lexington and Frankfort Railroad. The consolidated companies became known as the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Lexington Railroad, or the LC&L. The line from Louisville to Covington through Walton was completed in the spring of 1869 and became known as the Cincinnati Short Line, or the Cincinnati Connection. In 1881, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad bought the LC&L, and that's how it's known today. Construction began on the Cincinnati Southern Railroad on the back side of the house in 1868. By July of 1877, the Cincinnati Southern Railroad was completed through Walton, and the 336-mile route was completed by 1880. At the time, Robert F. and Attila Cleek owned the property. After the construction of the railroads, the property changed hands many, many times. Most of the owners lived here for as short as 1 year, some of them as long as 20 years. In the 1970s, John Galt bought the property and opened an antique shop within the home. Alan and Stephanie Jurdy bought the land in 1990 from Galt and began renovating the house. They were able to get quite a bit of work finished, but as you saw touring, there is still quite a bit of work to continue working on. Currently, the City of Walton has purchased the home with a Transportation Enhancement Grant, and the grant will be used to buy the home, finish the renovations, and open a Transportation and History Museum within the building. Although the history of the house and the family has its own unique oddities, the house may be best known for the ghost stories and rumors that surround the events that supposedly happened here. I know in my research I talked to a lot of people who grew up in the area who talked about that was all they knew about the house, were the ghost stories and the murders and stuff. So what I decided to do was try and verify that as best I could. To begin with, my field of knowledge is just impossible to prove or disprove a ghost story. It's very hard to do with facts. So the only thing that I can do is give evidence to a story or event that happened that would lead to rumors of ghost stories. An important note is that in the 1970s, John Galt ran what he called the Haunted House Antique Shop within the building. And he could have possibly have created some of these rumors, and if not created them, he could have furthered them to spur interest in his shop to get people to come. So with that in mind, I will look at some of the stories that I ran into within my research. A Kentucky Post article from November 26, 1897 states that a red mark of blood rests upon this old inn, which will be torn down in Kentucky. They were all very dramatic like that. Well, obviously that is the first incorrect fact that they got, because the building's still here. The article goes on to state that Rodney Gaines built the tavern around 1797 and that blood was shed under the reign of every proprietor. Now, first of all, this is the only place that I've seen the name Rodney Gaines, and I have seen the genealogy of the Gaines family. And Abner didn't live in Kentucky until 1800, so he could not have been, he wasn't even in northern Kentucky in 1800. He was still near Lexington, so the house was not built in 1797. The interesting part in this article is the discussion about the murder at a dance. The author claims that Robert Harrison murdered William Northcutt at a dance held in the tavern. The full details of the murder are explained in the Boone County Recorder's article, dated July 26, 1899. Although this author claims that Abner Gaines built the house in 1791, a full 10 years before he even appeared in Kentucky. The article goes on to describe how both Harrison and Northcutt came from wealthy and respected families, and that they were both in love with the same woman. At the ball, held in the late 1840s, Northcutt became upset when the woman chose Harrison, and Northcutt pulled Harrison's wig off of his head. According to the article, Harrison was very embarrassed about his bald head and immediately stabbed and killed Northcutt. Harrison was never charged for the crime because he, quote, had the sympathy of all present and of the entire community. But the article did say that he lived with the guilt for the rest of his life. This was written approximately 60 years after the event happened, and the articles both disagree on the date of the construction for the house, but they didn't get their facts correct either. In 1880, 40 years after the murder at the ball, the Daily Commonwealth reported that William B. Northcutt died at the age of 91 at his son's home in Morningview. Another death notice appears 13 years later in the Kentucky Post on June 19, 1893, this time for Robert Harrison. According to the notice, Harrison died at his home in Covington at the age of 70. This would make a 34-year difference in the ages of the two men, who were supposedly fighting over the same woman. Now, granted, cities and counties were not legally required to keep death notices and death certificates until 1911, so these may not be the same men as discussed in the article about the balls. But I didn't find any other William Northcutts and Robert Harrisons listed anywhere in the newspapers and death notices or anything, so chances are this is one of the fabricated rumors. Other stories that I found surrounding the house involve suicides. One suicide involved a prominent citizen of Covington, John Goodson. Goodson had been mayor of Covington from 1860 to 1864 and was also a state representative. On April 18, 1867, the Cincinnati Daily Inquirer reported that Goodson shot himself the day before at Gaines Tavern, which was just north of Walton. Although Archibald Gaines owned the land at the time, Jeremiah Glenn was reportedly the tavern manager, which I'm guessing that's why it was called Gaines Tavern. The next morning, on April 19, 1867, the same paper reported that the funeral would be held on April 30th at John G. Carlisle's home in Covington. Carlisle was a very important man in Kentucky politics, and at the time of the funeral, he had already been serving in the Kentucky State House of Representatives, and at that time, he was in the state Senate. He went on to become the Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky, a U.S. Representative from Kentucky, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and the U.S. Secretary of Treasury. Carlisle was Goodson's son-in-law, and that's why he held the funeral. So this house has connections to many national politicians. Two other suicides occurred at the home, both after Robert and Attila Cleek bought the property in 1873. On Monday, September 3, 1883, the Daily Commonwealth published a brief paragraph describing the death of Hugh Ingram. Ingram, a prominent and highly esteemed citizen, was found hanging from the beams of the Cincinnati Southern Railroad. The article claimed that a mad dog had bitten him 2 years before, and that people believed the suicide occurred because the dog bite had made Ingram insane. The bridge has since been torn down, but stone supports still exist in the bushes on either side of the railroads. The second suicide that reportedly happened while the Cleeks owned the property was in 1892. On May 11th, the Boone County Recorder printed an article describing the death of Lizzie Rice, Robert Cleek's sister-in-law. The details are very grim, but the article describes how Mrs. Rice pulled poured coal oil on herself and then lit a match, which then produced a very large fire. The Cleek family heard her and ran to help, but nothing they did helped, and 2 hours later she passed away. Just before her death, she reportedly told someone that she had just tired of living, although the article does lament the way in which she chose to die. In my research, I found many random ghost stories. There are many, many of them. But I cannot prove or disprove these through historical research. I did ask Mrs. Jurdy, who lived here at the time that I did my research, if she had ever seen anything strange within the house, and she said that within the 15 years that she had been living here, she never saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. That also depends on if you believe in ghosts. Sometimes it's a personal thing. My determination of whether or not a suicide story or a murder can be proved is based on how many sources verify that story and how recently the information was published in the newspaper compared to when the event actually happened. If the story was published within a few days or a few weeks of the event, I gave that much more truth than I did something that was published 40 years after the fact, because 40 years is a very large amount of time to be able for stories to blur or become exaggerated. Other rumors that surround the tavern involve the people who stayed here. The list of names is very impressive, with men such as Henry Clay, a Kentucky politician known as the Great Compromiser, and Richard M. Johnson, Vice President of the United States under Martin Van Buren, as well as General Lafayette, a Frenchman who played a pivotal role in gaining French support for the American Revolution. All of these men traveled to or lived in Kentucky during the time that Abner Gaines ran his tavern. But because I've not been able to find any records from the tavern or any of their personal diaries, yet another thing I have not had time to research, I have not been able to verify if they actually stayed here. I found no newspaper articles that claimed they did, just stories that people had told saying that they did. And so because I couldn't verify this information, that goes along with the exaggerated time period that you just can't verify it after so much time. The Gaines Tavern is very important for many reasons. The first is that it's the beginning of the city of Walton. Abner Gaines moved to the area in 1804, just 5 years after Boone County was formed from Campbell County. According to the City of Walton's website, the area was known as Gaines Fork Roads, then Gaines Crossroads, and this is the name that Abner refers to in his will. The Secretary of State, Trey Grayson's website, states that the city of Walton was established on June 21st, 1840. This is just 3 months after Abner's death. So why they would change the name, the city was named after him, the man died, and 3 months later they changed the name away from his name. I have yet to explain that. Other than being home to one of the earliest members of Walton society, there are many historical reasons that this house is significant. Abner Gaines ran an important stagecoach line connecting Cincinnati and northern Kentucky, but he was also an important political figure within the community. This house in Walton, Kentucky is connected to national history through Abner's son, John Pollard Gaines, who held an influential position in the company that modernized the road, but he was also served in many wars and was elected to Congress and became governor of Oregon Territory. Abner's oldest son, James Matthews Gaines, also provided an important service to the city, as he was the first postmaster elected in 1815. The family's actions are not the only reason that this house is important. Architecturally, it is an older house that represents the federal style, which is not seen very often in this area. Not anymore, anyhow. The Gaines Tavern also holds importance to the city as a reminder of where the city started and how it has changed from that beginning. Even in the future, the tavern will be significant as an educational museum that will present information about the city's heritage and the city's past. There are many rumors surrounding the Gaines Tavern, and there are still many questions that I would love to be able to answer. Overall, the history of the house and the people that lived here are important and an interesting piece of the history of the area. With this new museum, many more questions will be answered, and the city will begin to know even more about their heritage.
Yeah, I do. Do you have a list of the people that own the property?
I do have a very brief list. When I did my research, I focused on Abner Gaines's time here. So I pretty much stopped at about 1860, 1870, because that's when the Gaines family sold the property. I tried to continue doing a deed search. I think I got up to about 1920. I can make that available. I think I may have sent that to the Boone County Library.
Well, it had been after 1920, but my great aunt, Aunt Libby Ingram, lived in here for quite some time when I wasn't even a teenager yet.
Okay, what was the last name?
Ingram, Libby Ingram.
Oh, okay.
And she ended up owning the toll gate house over there, which is the Punk Mill. And my grandparents both lived in there and died there.
Oh, wow, okay. No, I definitely didn't get that far. I was focusing mostly on Abner and his time here, trying to clear up the early history of it.
Is there any record of the people who might have worked on the railroad? You know, any, like, how much they were, any list of the workers who worked building the road around here?
There could be. That's yet another thing that I was not able to look at. I was looking at the railroads in connection to how it impacted the family.
We were more interested in trying to find out about our great-grandfather
Okay.
who lived on Frogtown Road
Oh, okay.
in the Richwood area. And I was thinking that maybe some of his sons might have worked on the road
Sure.
as they got older.
This 1870 census will show if they're like local residents of Boone County, okay? There will be a list for like probably Walton, okay? If the railroad had workers living in town at the time of the census. It won't cover all of the workers, but it will say railroad, something about the railroad in the 1870 census, okay? When they were building these railroads, okay? Also, hi Bruce.
Hi, Richard.
If they were living, is it the Haney family?
Haley, Haley.
If they did work on the line, in the census, it would have said railroad
Okay, well,
next to their names.
the one son, the oldest son, isn't, let's see, it was in the 1870 census and it didn't say anything about that. He was
Okay.
on the farm.
They were pretty specific. If they worked for the railroad, they were pretty specific
Okay.
for that in the census,
Okay.
all across the country, at any given point.
Have you looked in the records of the Covington and Lexington Turnpike Company?
No.
Okay.
We know that our great-grandfather bought part of his land from that company.
Okay.
He bought like 12 acres or something like that, or 12, what was it, 2.5 acres on the corner. Must have wanted access to the highway or something, and bought two and some odd acres
Okay.
from the Lexington Turnpike Company, whatever it was called, Lexington Railroad or something.
I didn't get into the
forget.
history of the railroad company. I just was looking at its connection to this site. But the company may have records on.
Okay.
I don't know if they would have kept employee records or anything, but it's worth a shot.
There is a railroad board
Mhm.
in Louisville. I don't know if they kept records back that early, but they do have it. They have a special retirement fund separate from the Social Security, and so they have their own death certificates and everything. And some of them are online, and others you can get that information through Louisville. I don't know how far. I don't think they go back that early. But it's always, if they worked on the lines for a little while, they may have continued.
Well,
Would that
we
be
thought
at the
since all of the sons were listed as laborers, I just took a wild guess that they might have worked on the road, you know, but it didn't say that in
If
the
it didn't
census.
say railroad, I wouldn't be able to say for sure.
But the Filson in Louisville would have that, maybe.
Well, the railroad board actually has their own organization
Oh, okay.
in Louisville.
I have a comment and then a question. First, I want to commend you for what seems to be a very, very extensive piece of work.
Thank you.
Very well done.
I
Are you
have
from this area?
I have something written at the time. It is a man named Stedman He was a paper maker, him and his father. And they stayed at this tavern. And I somewhat hesitant to read it, but he writes phonetically. And they were in Lebanon, Ohio, going to Georgetown. They had no money to speak of. In other words, no horse. So him and his father walked it. Anyway, they started in October. Did any boy have such a joyous anticipation as I had that night of home, sweet home, seeing dear mother, dear sister, Sophia, Mary, and that dear and only little sister and the only little girl. Still, she was the youngest. All the rest have gone to pay their debt, the old hand pens, and this one paid too. So anyway, Father had $100 or more in cash. He had got me a nice new set of clothes. I had my duds and a large bandana handkerchief on the end of a cane that was on my shoulder. I was wending my way homewards. We walked to Cincinnati that day in the morning. Father, thinking goods were so much cheaper in Cincinnati than Georgetown, he bought a dress and a piece for the family and put that part in my bundle to carry. I think my bundle would weigh at least 25 pounds. I thought so when we crossed the Ohio and landed in Covington. But although too much for a boy to carry some 80 miles on foot, it seemed light to me in anticipation of going home. In leaving Covington, we took the wrong road, R-O-N-G. A kind of a country road that came into a noted place on the road called Gaines Tavern. I don't think that on the road we came between Covington and Gaines Tavern, there was but 2 houses in the distance of 30 miles. I was very tired. The bundle was too heavy for me to carry this night, and I slept but little. In the morning, we had the Ridge Road before us, a wilderness in its day. Only 2 taverns between here and Georgetown. Theobald's Tavern, kept by Tom Theobald of Frankfort. Father and I had no water on the road. At one time, we had to leave the road and go 1 mile to get a drink and back to the road. The weather was pleasant and getting cool. Might make some mention that once you top the hill out of Covington, the next water is 63 miles away at Eagle Creek. It runs this road all the way down. So this young man, they were going, and they had not enough money for a horse. The road was not macadamized. They probably come up what you might call Bank Lick Creek, which is the L&N Rhine now. That would indicate the wrong road. Had they been on the Ridge Road, in other words, when you leave Covington, as you go up, you don't normally go around and up over a hill to start with. You would then go through Latonia, perhaps. What do you find? Bank Lick Creek. And the road then would go up Bank Lick Creek. In the 1883 atlas, it shows this road coming up Bank Lick Station Road. Then it also turns and comes into Gaines's Crossroads. Also shows it going out the ridge towards Nicholson. Also, there is the Independence, what they call it, Independence Big Bone Road, which is the Beaver Road, running to Big Bone. Then you have the Union Road, which is now Chambers Road, across by the Presbyterian Church up Hicks Pike into Union. So this was truly a crossroads. From any direction, you most generally had to go to Gaines's Tavern. And I was often wondered, you speak of several acres, much more so than is between the railroad and the highway. this poor property was cut 3 times by the Southern, the L&N, and later by the US 25. This was the main drag right out here. So it was cut in 2-3 times. So what we're seeing now, in essence, is might say a city lot. No more than that. Perhaps 7 acres. I think that's what it is.
A little over 7 acres.
And but at one time, particularly when he wrote this, sometime in the 1820s, this is when this man wrote this. And I also have in my Civil War research, I did find this. This is a letter written by Basil W. Duke, who was involved with the skirmish down here at Snow's Pond, which is about maybe 1.5 miles, 2 miles from here. I'm going to let this rest just a little bit. While I was raised between the tracks, I don't hear them, but you guys, you hear them. So anyway.